Not sure where exactly that is, so I'm just gonna stand right here. Oh, hi, Claudia. Welcome everybody. I guess we can probably start the recording now. For those that are on Zoom, you should see the little thing pop up. Good morning. Welcome to another colloquium in the 50th anniversary of the Ostrom workshop year. So it's really, really exciting. Today we're honored to have a longtime friend of the workshop, Eric Alston, here from the University of Colorado. His talk today is Norms, Institutions, and Digital Veils of Uncertainty. Do network protocols even need trust anyway? A brief introduction, although as we were just discussing, a paragraph is probably insufficient to cover everything here. But Eric is a scholar in residence in the finance division and the faculty director of the Hernando de Soto Capital Markets program in the Lead School at the University of Colorado in Boulder. He also serves as a research associate with Comparative Constitutions Project. He received an MA in economics and at Maryland and a JD from the University of Chicago. His research and teaching is really in the fields of law and economics and institutions and organizational analysis, conceptual methodological toolkits, of which he applies to questions in the development of rights along and in new frontiers, the design and implementation of constitutions, and digital governance challenges with an emphasis on cryptocurrencies and blockchain networks. So clearly a very narrow scope of application for his research. I don't want to, as I mentioned, we could probably go on, but it's very nice to have you back. We're really looking forward to your talk. And with that, I will let it go. I think you know the way this works, but just a reminder, right? 15 to 20 minutes presentation. I will keep a queue of questions. I will do my best to also watch online.
I just posted that I'll help moderate online. So
fantastic.
Yeah, I'll let you know.
Clarifying questions only in the course of the presentation, and then hopefully a wonderful and fruitful conversation after 20 minutes.
Awesome.
All right, great.
So thanks all for coming, and thanks as well to the Zoom audience. And in light of that, I actually have some questions about Zoom. So this is a screenshot from this morning, kind of reliving the, weird anxiety dreams you sometimes get before presenting. And I was like, is my Zoom going to look like this tomorrow? No one attending. But I have a deeper point to make. And I'm actually curious, how do you all run your Zoom chats? Because some that I've attended, they're pretty locked down. There's a Q&A box, but the chat is disabled.
Mm-hmm.
Some I've attended are even more locked down where is the camera on? Can you even turn the camera on?
Yeah.
Frankly, many of those I show up and in some cases I'm kind of relieved when it's like no camera function. I'm like, that's awesome. Like, great. I can actually step back and, do other tab and email work while listening to hopefully an interesting talk.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I've been to some, especially digital governance focused events, presentations, both as an attendee, but also as a presenter, where clearly it's a very Discord native audience in the sense that there's a running stream of stuff in the chat, emojis, just like, and it's some presenters hate that. I've literally seen them at some point say, I'm going to minimize the chat because it's so distracting to me as I'm going along. Other presenters, myself included, I don't mind it. I like seeing a level of engagement. Sometimes an interesting and very apropos question populates into the chat. I can grab it in real time, but that probably emphasizes the fact that I'm somewhat spanning the pre-ADHD generation with the modern digital era where we're used to having a chat box open. I have Telegram, Signal, Discord, Slack, all open on my computer at the same time. The number of notifications, it's a sea of red dots. I've come to deal with that. I wouldn't even necessarily say that that's a productive equilibrium, but it is a normative equilibrium within certain digital communities.
Mm-hmm.
And so the choices of how you run your Zoom chat reflect an underlying normative set of priors. How chaotic do we want the chat to be? But also, depending on the audience, you might not have the nicely curated audience that you tend to get at the Ostrom workshop, and it could be randos from every corner of the internet. Do you want to open up your chat to be available to anyone, and maybe someone with an axe to grind with one of your panelists, maybe someone who's angry they weren't selected as a panelist? I've seen very inappropriate things appear in Zoom chats. Or, I actually did at one point at a virtual seminar. I won't throw the organizing group under the bus because this wasn't their fault, but somebody forgot to turn off their camera while they were changing clothes in the room in which they were in which the seminar was occurring. And so they suddenly show up shirtless on screen, and they were in their 50s. I won't give you any more detail than that, but it's definitely not a sight you wanted to see. And so to me, these are institutional choices embedded in a digitally networked environment. And so both to welcome those who are present on the Zoom chat today, but also to just situate what I'm talking about is we tend to institutionalize, to the extent possible, in digitally networked organizational contexts, a set of normative intentions. And so that's going on in Zoom. But my contention is, and my interest in writing this piece is part of a stream of my scholarship surrounding the increasingly digital nature of our world and what we can learn from the traditional studies of governance that have been occurring, arguably, I would say, since time immemorial. I don't think governance will ever go away. This piece, one of the sort of 10,000-foot level takeaways is you can't automate away human decision-making, especially for the most important components of organizational processes. I also want to say, though, to the extent we can fully automate in a way that is not lossy the preferences of every member of the community for coordination, we should. This isn't antithetical to smart contract design. I engage in a variety of consulting projects with predominant cryptocurrency networks. I constituted one of the world's first data trusts earlier this year, which is not crypto adjacent. It's just a new model for governing data. And so for me, I think to the extent that we can automate coordinative processes among humans, we should be doing so. But I think there are massive upper limits that protocol designers in particular are less well situated to understanding about the true, like the full scope of what can be automated and how reliably it can be automated and whether or not you need a default button that hits stop. And so one of my fun projects this summer was with the Ethereum Foundation's Summer of Protocols program entitled Kill Switch Protocols, and examining exactly that question. How do you embed a recursive failsafe that enables human judgment vis-a-vis the intended purposes of the system to be executed when the system starts running off the rails? Happy to talk about that more later, but I am short on time. One of the challenges, and I was talking to Jesse Kate about this at dinner briefly last night, of writing about constitutions, about institutions, about organizations, about all of these ubiquitous human processes is everyone has a definition of each of these words I've listed up here, at least implicitly, usually explicitly. Problem is, given their ubiquity, there's significant drift between the intended underlying meanings. So real quick, I want to define a few things that are central to my analysis to hopefully ground the conversation. And we can have a robust debate about, whether or not norms should be properly understood as a subset of institutions. But a social group is, to me, the loosest form of kind of human social organization. I show up to a gas station at the border of Indiana, Illinois yesterday, and all the pumps are full except for one. That is a social group. My independent intent has thrown me into a group. We do not have any formal bonds with one another other than the fact that we all showed up to this gas station. Contrast that with an organization. And I would say this room in particular is a nice example of how much these things overlap in practice, which is thanks to the Ostrom Workshop funding my stay here, we actually have a contractual bond. Even if they hadn't set down expectations for my visit, there still would be one construed by most courts as a function of them engaging in planning for my visit, as well as expending non-trivial resources in furtherance of my coming here. And so if I didn't show up this morning, that would probably be a pretty good argument for why maybe I don't get, you don't reimburse me because you gave me a free trip to Illinois to see my friends, and then I just bail on the workshop altogether. But there are many of you in this room that probably don't have or may not have direct contractual bonds with the Ostrom Workshop itself. Most social environments are overlapping nests of both organizations as well as random social groups that people show up to. If a gas station attendant had come out yesterday, they have a formal contractual relationship with that particular gas station relative to all the individuals who are interacting with one another. But make no mistake, there are many, many things I could have done, including my initially figuring out how to park the unnecessarily long truck they decided to give me at the Indianapolis airport in such a way at this crowded gas station when I don't have that large of a vehicle in the first instance. And so these things naturally are overlapping in ways that makes disentangling them rigorously for the purposes of analysis in considering governance outcomes hard. But to me, what delimits an organization from a social group is fundamentally a constitution. I use a constitution in a very general sense that annoys a lot of people. I don't mean the public government document that delimits rights and special government authorities and the ability to draft law, to execute law, and to enforce law. That is a public constitution properly construed. But I see the function of constituting organizations as fundamentally far more emergent than that. It's a set of secondary rules that need to be entrenched relative to ordinary decision-making processes in order for a group to productively reach collective decisions. That then often tends to involve concentrations of authority because of the efficiencies of delegated representation. And often, in order to coordinate a large enough group, you need to set aside certain components of decision-making that are not within scope of the group. The legislature generally can't take someone's life as a decision that they reach through the execution of their constitutionally specified internal processes. I'm describing the emergence of bills of rights in public constitutional contexts in particular. But the general function of a constitution is to constitute an organization. So a constitution constitutes an organization, which then institutes institutions upon those subject to its enforcement authority. Quite a mouthful. But that is to me the triumvirate of formally defined rules. People come together with deliberate intent, say we're here to do a thing, we're constituting this group. This is how we make decisions within this group. This is who makes those decisions, and the specific rules that they articulate are institutions within the vernacular I prefer. If the move that I make more explicitly in the paper rubs you the wrong way, which is norms are not institutions, I'm happy to fight that battle in the Q&A. But you can generally read my paper without loss of generality. When I say institution, just read formal institution. And when I say norms, read in the class that you're all familiar with of informal institutions that are traditionally called norms. Trust versus confidence. How do I disambiguate those in my analysis? I spent a fun period with the European Research Council's Blockchain Gov group reading everything we could about trust. What is trust? How do you essentially define trust? Like many of these other ubiquitous terms, pretty hard to pin down an agreed upon definition in the literature, but one that emerged that I think has a lot of purchase is trust involves your placing yourself in a position of vulnerability with respect to the agency of another human decision maker. That's crucial. Confidence, in contrast, is a probabilistic assessment of a situation based on empirical information that you have, and it might just be you perceiving the reality of a situation in front of you, but not involving that fundamentally sort of messy, squirrely human intent to decide whether or not to harm you as a function of the trust that that other individual is placing in that particular agentic individual. And so confidence is based on empirically observed reality. Trust tends to involve an element that goes further than that. If it's just you're making a probabilistic calculation that the person you've never met is sufficiently scared of the law that they will not, take your money and not give you what they say they're going to give you, that is confidence. But the act of truly trusting someone is, in the literature, the fairly deep literature on it, it involves a position of vulnerability that is not empirically verifiable as a function of information you're observing or can glean from the environment surrounding it. Finally, there's the sort of canonical, at least for folks in finance, econ, and law like I am, distinction between risk and uncertainty. There are harms we don't want to happen in the future, and we can list them all and we can assess a rough probability to them. And then there is that lurking possibility within complex systems of Knightian uncertainty. Douglas North used non-ergodicity. The non-ergodic nature of the world is a real beast. And that is, to me, the distinction between risk and uncertainty. But I've got a decent amount to get through. What's wrong with these pictures? And all pictures but one in this particular talk. If I tell you these guys are going to an interview at a financial law firm, are they violating a norm of any kind? I mean, you might say, like, the way fashion trends are going these days, these guys look just on point. But I hope at a financial law firm on Wall Street, showing up shoeless would be considered to be a fairly significant violation of the expectations for your dress code at that interview. But what are they doing when they say, we are not interviewing you? I suspect if someone showed up at some of the financial law firms I've dealt with, the secretary would not let them in the door to interview with the partners if they didn't have shoes on. Literally, the normative filtering would be occurring before they even got in the room. They would not get a call back, and they certainly would not get a job offer. But how is that enforcement occurring? They do not have a bond of contract between them and the firm that they want to work for. To me, that's fundamentally the essence of normative enforcement. Let's say they don't wear those shoes for their interview. They're dressed pretty dapper. If that's all it takes to get employed at a financial law firm, let's say it is, they get the offer. They show up for their first day of work looking like this. At that point, there is probably a policy that they are contracted into that says you are expected to look this way when you come to work. They get fired or they get a warning. You name the sanctions tied to the enforcement of that institution, and that would be an institution. Guess what? The institutional preferences of the firm deeply mirror the normative preferences that undergird those institutions. So the same response they have in the interview when they show up without shoes on is enshrined in a dress code. But the big distinction is until they're working there, until they're contracted into that job, they don't actually have enforcement authority. So they're relegated to the sort of the context of normative enforcement in particular. So norms are an external constraint on individual behavior that emerges from the semi-random aggregation of individuals' preferences for others' behavior within social groups one intends to act within. To me, we all have normative preferences for others' behavior. But for me to condition my behavior coming into this room today, I'm assuming that enough of you hold a norm that I might want to violate. Maybe I am the sort of freewheeling hippie in these photos that's like, I just want to be barefoot. But I care enough about your opinion of me and what you might do to me that I didn't show up to this particular talk barefoot. Notwithstanding, I don't know how many of you, maybe a subset of you are like, man, I would have liked you a lot more if you were barefoot, if you rolled in that way. And so it's necessarily you're in expectation, a kind of Bayesian calculation of what are everyone's likely normative preferences in a particular group going to be. Challenge is I suspect a lot of people in this room are far more well-traveled than the average individual out there. So I think this analogy might land. But have you ever been in a sufficiently foreign location where you're kind of frozen, where you're like, I literally don't know how to act in this completely, foreign society? You're very cautious, precisely because you're like this normative mesh that you're so used to being reasonably confident in where it's situated is so far from one. And guess what? It's a lot harder to figure out what the norms are other than just breaking them and having them enforced on you than it is to figure out what the policies are, because policies require deliberate foresight articulated by policymakers in a particular environment. And so the distinction between confidence and trust, I'm trying to get a grant to go study this island. So this is the only non-Midjourney generated image. This is the island of Tristan de Cunha, extremely remote. Draw a line between South Africa and Brazil, And in the middle of the Atlantic, in that remote area, is where you will find Tristan de Cunha. But what's particularly interesting about it, in addition to its isolation, is about 250 people live there total. To me, quite plausibly, especially in such an isolated environment, well below Dunbar's number. So in contexts where you know one another really well, bonds of sort of normative bonds often provide governance. My vision of institutions is they're a scalar mechanism. Once you transition to the impersonal and human social groups, as well as organizations, you tend to need to deliberately articulate rules that will be enforced by a third-party enforcer within that group. So for me, institutions enable us to scale from the fundamentally personal social groups that are limited by Dunbar's number, as it's called, to the impersonal. And this move is accompanied by a transition from trust or distrust. Personal communities are not ones where everyone trusts one another. They know for very deep experiential reasons who they should trust and who they shouldn't trust. In contrast, once you scale to the impersonal level, you have institutions and a sufficient confidence that they will be enforced by a third-party enforcer. So to me, this is meant to evoke how remote many contexts are where littering laws are present. And we have a section in our institutional and organizational analysis textbook arguing that the plausible decline in littering in the United States from the late 1960s onwards is not due to the proliferation of anti-littering laws that emerged during that period. It's really hard to enforce. I go over that hill and I've got a piece of trash in my car that I want to throw out. Once they're out of sight, they have no ability to probabilistically enforce on me. And police officers spend their time pursuing a lot of nasty crimes alongside a relatively minor crime. But what did happen during this time period? One, a lot of people started to care about the environment a whole lot more. And second, that meant even if you didn't, the likelihood that someone, your car passenger, anyone witnessing you doing something also disapproved of littering, commensurately increased. And so my argument, our argument in print is that, hey, it's actually the laws are reflecting an underlying normative change that occurred in society, often attributed to the publication of the Silent Spring. Regardless of whether that is the one causal force or just generally we started caring about our environment a lot more, it's that normative shift that led to a decline in littering is our contention. And so this has a deep implication though. Norms apply to predictable and unpredictable behavior alike. There are many things I could do in this very moment that would trigger a strong normative response from this audience that none of you could have possibly conceptualized last night. That's the messiness of human behavior. That's the non-ergodicity that Douglas North was talking about. In contrast, though, when you define an institution, you activate the collective decision-making apparatus of a particular organization. Therefore, you need to specify what is acceptable or unacceptable behavior, what is proscribed or prescribed behavior under the context of a formally devised institution. That requires foresight. By definition, mechanically, by construction, that means you're thinking through the action space of downstream participants and saying, this is acceptable or this is unacceptable. Problem is, that means institutions are necessarily blind to downstream consequences that institutional designers could not foresee. These have an overlapping role in governance. I use the analogy in the piece to say institutions are like a spotlight. They precisely illuminate a specific class of human behavior, but leave everything else around them unspecified vis-a-vis the particular proscriptions of an institution. In contrast, norms are vexing, and the analogy is more deliberate than it might initially appear. They cover everything in a particular context. Whether or not I do something you could have predicted that triggers a normative response or could not have predicted, it will, if it does so, trigger a normative response within this particular context. So they're like a blanket. They cover a much broader range of human behavior in these social groups where normative enforcement is occurring. The problem is, though, how easily can you see as a third-party observer who is underneath a blanket in a particular room? By definition, you can't. If they're literally covered by the blanket, you can't perceive the identities. And so my contention is norms' greater coverage comes at the cost of intense context specificity, meaning they're unique to this particular assemblage of individuals in this room. And if we change the composition of individuals, even drawn from Indiana University, the set of norms probably are only slightly different, but are still different than the particular assemblage of individuals in a given context. And so, to me, there's a deeper implication of the fact that you can't predict all downstream outcomes and therefore can't predict all behavior subject to institutional definition. Norms are the natural input in truly unanticipated situations for any organization because institutions cannot fully govern the unanticipated. And so these norms will be the source of governance in the face of unknown unknowns because that is what institutions necessarily channel in those contexts. But are they really this rigid? I've been like, norms are flexible, they're context specific, they cover known and unknown behavior alike. Institutions require foresight. Pretty dismal view of institutions for someone dedicated to the study of institutions. Are they actually this rigid? No. We've long developed means to make institutions approach, although not perfectly mirror, the comparative flexibility of norms. Default rules, so call options in financial contexts, escrow, the threat of third-party contract enforcement generally is thought to beneficially sort of constrain the behavior of individuals subject to a particular contractual bond. Ex post adjudication following enforcement. There's a reason we separate the ability to judge. And substantive and procedural checks on the execution of our systemic processes. And so I've worked for the Exoneration Project, litigating post-conviction and habeas cases in law school, and those are fundamentally kind of escape holes by which people can still make a claim despite process being perfect, that substance suggests this was a fundamental deprivation of someone's liberty. Relational contracting stands as another example. So we've got plenty of these examples. I work a lot in consulting on governance design for distributed networks. And in particular, a lot of them are like, we speed ran governance. We read everything we could in 2 months, and now we've got a governance module for our network. And I'm like, I've been studying this for over 10 years, and I don't think it's something you can ever speed run. It's context specific, it's hard, it's messy. It's, it's the stuff we're devoting our lives to studying, but I suspect most of you are like, you can't learn everything you need to know about governance in 2 months. And so, to me, what we're seeing, unsurprisingly, is the emergence of different forms of the mechanisms of institutional flexibility to better accommodate the reality that it's messy, that it's uncertain, that we can't predict all relevant downstream outcomes. So we've got ex post adjudication emerging in the case of Facebook's oversight board. Default rules are proliferating with decentralized financial instruments in particular, unsurprisingly. Veto gates, as well as polycentricity, I helped to constitute one of the world's first data trusts. And that data trust has, probably not surprisingly to you, given my intro, a circuit breaker function by which the board of trustees can batch revoke all data contributors' consent from the third parties that are using their data. That's checking the authority of end users of data using polycentricity and more complex governance design by creating a veto gate there. And so, to me, the big punchline is more for people who design smart contracts, who design complex network protocols, coordinating people in this new digital realm. To me, you need to seriously consider the norms of the community whose interactions are being constituted into a given protocol, precisely because those will be the source of governance in times that the particular community could not predict. That's all I've got. Sorry for going over time.
It's okay.
Okay, great. So, first question. can start, but
Students. Regardless of the question, blockchain's the answer, guys.
I have just like
Please just.
a loose kind of inquiry based on what you're saying, which is thinking about the design of norms themselves. Like if your institutional rules and design are operating on a backdrop of existing norms, the norms do come from somewhere. And some of the things coming up for me listening to you talk included when and how do we design norms? Can we design norms intentionally or even preemptively, knowing that institutions will be constituted on their blanket landscape? And have you thought much about strategic norm?
I think that is a hugely important question, although I'm very dismal about the relative limitations on our ability to shift norms within social groups. Have you ever tried to start a fashion trend? People do so, but with much less predictable regularity than, and to me, it cuts very, very, very deep to the human essence, which is, to me, there are three ways you can try to shift someone's beliefs. And so I see trying to shift someone's norms as tantamount to trying to shift their beliefs. And the first is to say that actually, I want to change your mind about something, but I'm going to deceive you. I'm not going to tell you that that's my goal. So I'm going to present you a bunch of information, and hopefully by the end of it, your mind will change. Most people intelligent enough to pull information from it and possibly have their mind changed are also intelligent enough to realize they're in a context where someone's trying to shift a core belief, and the opponent on the other side of that hasn't even had the human decency to tell them that their intent is to shift their belief. And so the moment that most people cotton on to the fact that they're partly like, they're being subject to propaganda to change their beliefs, they hunker down and they hold to that original belief even tighter. Second option is to come to someone and say, you're wrong about this belief you hold. At least I have enough fundamental respect for you that I'm willing to come to you and tell you to your face. Still, the response tends to be, I'm going to hold tight to this belief even harder, in part because the implicit sort of underlying message to, hey, you're wrong about this fundamental thing that you have a tightly held belief about is you are either malevolent, which is, there are all these bad consequences to this belief and you don't care, or you're so stupid, you don't see all of these bad consequences to this belief, and ergo, I'm going to enlighten you from my position of relatively better knowledge. Again, not a particularly effective way of changing people's beliefs. And so, in my experience, the best you can do is be somewhat open about your intent and present information in as balanced a way as possible. But guess what? It's still really, really, really hard. And so it's not to say we shouldn't be asking that question, but the channels by which normative change occur are so much deeper and I think so much more incremental in society that it's not a particularly productive constructivist errand, especially for, say, the government to say, we're going to change this attitude on the part of members of society. There are many well-meaning nonprofits that are trying to do exactly that with respect to environmental beliefs, with respect to awful racist beliefs that persist. And so none of this is an argument that we shouldn't be trying to do that. It's a fundamentally different firmament from which norms are emanating. That, to me, it's so easy to change a law or policy relative to changing the normative firmament held by many, many independent individuals. All you need to do is sufficiently influence the legislature or sufficiently influence, you name the policy-making authority within a particular organization. It's not to say changing institutions is easy. Relative to deliberately changing norms in the direction you want, changing institutions is easy. But you're asking the right question, and this came up a lot at CO. There was quite a focus on norms at CO this year, and definitely it's a kind of a hard two-step because clearly a lot of the people engaged in the rigorous study of norms in different communities would like on some margins to change those norms. And I think they'd be inhuman if they didn't want that, given some of the communities they're working in. You know, there are many great things about pastoralists in Kenya, but there are many, I would say, modern liberal values that their cultural norms do not reflect in ways I consider to be suboptimal. So it's not to critique that natural impetus, but it's also to say changing norms is pretty darn hard.
CO, sorry.
Society for Institutional and Organizational Econ, annual confab for folks in the Ostrom workshops ambit, among others.
There, be square. If you wouldn't mind just minimizing the screen,
Oh, yeah.
because there's some folks on Zoom. Maybe you want to do Mike next? You want to
Yeah.
do folks in the
Why
room?
don't you Mike next and then Claudia and then back to online and then Jamie?
So, Mike, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. And Eric's good to see you back in Bloomington. Sorry, I can't be there in person, but an interesting talk. And the paper was interesting when you got into some of the examples of the kinds of manipulation of the protocol systems in these digital communities using misinformation or scams of various kinds with insider information and stuff like that. As an old IR scholar, I found that kind of interesting, sort of very more Machiavellian than what came through in this talk. So let me push you a little bit on one of your terms. I know we can argue about norms and rules and stuff like that forever, and I don't want to do that. But you kept saying that norms were an aggregated of individual preferences for others' behavior. And I'd be much more comfortable saying this, it's aggregate expectations, because I don't really care. I mean, it's hard for me to say I have a preference over someone else's behavior. I have an interest in having some information about what that individual may do, because if I'm trying to run a scam on them, I kind of want to know what they're going to be doing. It's not that I prefer that that's what they do, except because it'll help my scam. And I wonder if you could look a little more at the perception of people who are trying to take advantage of the norms rather than simply live within them, and to what extent your analysis helps the governance, digitally based governance sort of system handle that kind of Machiavellian behavior.
There's a lot there. But no, to me, the more you drill into defining a norm, the more squirrely it kind of becomes. And I see kind of three underlying distinct camps. One makes it reside at the individual level, but that then poses an aggregation problem, which is if there's just only one random person at the law firm that would be annoyed by my wearing, the example I use is white athletic socks in the publication, but Midjourney could not do white athletic socks. I got a ream of men in white athletic sock looking suits, which was not the image I was going for. So I went with barefoot. But the point carries, which is if only one person had that preference, it's sufficiently low likelihood that my preference for behaving contrary to an expected norm is not plausibly conditioned. And so for me, we talk a lot about the power of norms in conditioning behavior, which I completely agree with. But the more you go down to the individual level of, well, I call that a normative preference for other individuals' behavior. We all have that. But for me, my definition does rely on some measure of aggregation, which is that it needs to be sufficiently held within a group to condition my behavior before it occurs. And so I think it's interesting the cases where norms enforcement actually is visited upon individuals, but a lot of the interesting discussion about norms is they create the governance outcome without the enforcement needing to occur with high regularity. And so for me, a sign that a norm is breaking down within a group might actually be high levels of normative enforcement, because it's showing that a lot of people are making that calculus and either they're willing to run the penalty or they're thinking like, wow, it's weird that 60% of that group didn't like that thing I did. The other 40% clearly did. And so to me, it's definitely the level of aggregation that intuitively tracks to the governance outcomes that we so frequently point to when we're talking about norms as such an important component of governance in practice. And so to me, You're right, the paper is thin currently on the adversarial or Machiavellian intent, which I definitely want to think through further, although at some level, that's like a more meta recursive problem in the sense that for me, the relevant person to consider with respect to the enforcement of a norm is the individual that wants to transgress it. It's not relevant to talk about most people applying at that financial law firm because none of them want to go barefoot or wear white athletic socks. And so fundamentally, the stance you want to place yourself in when assessing a particular norm is the person who would like to transgress it but does not because of the underlying fear of enforcement in the social environment they're about to step into. But there's a secondary question where assessing the entire normative firmament of a group is extremely relevant for someone with adversarial intent for the purposes of the system at a broader level. And so to me, norms, like my preferred definition of institutions, which is why I carve out constitutions and organizations, are relatively specific rules relative to the nexus of contracts that is an organization or the set of secondary rules that is a constitution. For me, norms are better understood as, a preference against a certain behavior in a certain context. And the aggregation of those, I think, properly is part of what ladders up to culture. So none of this is to belittle the importance of culture, but for me, the disaggregated component of the bag of normative preferences for others' behavior that a culture contains, norms is the proper disaggregation, and therefore they're more specific than someone with sort of general adversarial intent to a system might, like that lens is a more general one than the specificity of a given norm. I'm not sure I satisfactorily answered your question, but great point. I don't think I'm strong on the adversarial intent of anyone entering a system more generally.
That's fine. Thanks.
And then back online.
Thank you, Eric, for the wonderful presentation. And I wonder, in developing settings, you say that probably it's easier to change institutions than norms. What happens in those settings where institutions might be in place, but the enforcement is quite difficult? So how to change that? Because if we want to acquire that completeness, we would like to have norms and institutions. Yeah, one is supposed to reinforce the other one. But in this case, the lack of enforcement will deny that percentage of institutions to be in place.
So my answer is somewhat dismal, in the sense that I agree with you, enforcement capacity should properly be taken into account when assessing the viability of a particular institution. But more vexingly, a given institution holding enforcement capacity equal is limited by the underlying normative context in which that institution is being implemented. What do I mean by that? The two examples I give in my paper, in a very offhand way, but they make the point, I think, nicely, are that of marijuana prohibition in the United States and the civil rights movement. The way I cast the civil rights movement is a lot of people slowly through the processes of education, maybe through just living around their fellow man, became less racist. Not quick enough by my take, but it led to a level of support for the laws that passed in the wake of the civil rights movement. I'm not saying those laws had no effect, but there was a sufficient normative core prior to them being institutionalized in society. And so absent sufficient support for anti-racist laws, what we tend to get are laws that are on the books but are unenforceable because of how far away they are from the normative core of the people being governed. The flip example is we tried for a long time to tell people, don't smoke marijuana. We will imprison you in some cases for the rest of your natural life for smoking this particular drug. Have we been particularly effective in enforcing that prohibition? To me, the wave of legal change that we're currently experiencing in the United States is a direct testament to if you articulate deliberately a particular law that's far enough away from the normative core of individuals, it will be unenforceable in practice or at huge cost. And so that's why I don't view as separable. When you're engaging in institutional design, you're making a fundamentally important point, which is you need to consider the capacity of enforcement, because even if that institutional preference tracks well to underlying norms, if the capacity is so lacking, you might delegitimize the entire institutional apparatus, because they're like, look at all these laws that are on the books that no one's enforcing. What a sham of a constitution and institutional environment we have. But more fundamentally, and this is kind of one of the reasons I'm interested in norms as a core from which institutions are formalized, to me, there are so many examples of too much of a belief in the power of legal positivism, which is if we legislate it, it will be so. And to me, absent considering the extent of a normative balance within the community that those institutions are being implemented upon, that might mean fundamentally unenforceable institutions, or ones that you have to expend an incredible amount to successfully enforce, and potentially at great cost to the legitimacy of your overarching system. Because in my, growing up, everyone I knew that smoked marijuana was pretty deeply skeptical of the entire apparatus of government. And I wonder if it had to be that way, in the sense that for those individuals, some of them, they finally at age 12, at age 14, came to realize that a parent smoked, that a favored uncle smoked pot. And at a very formative age, they're given, when you've learned up until that point, breaking the law is bad. Everything that the law says is bad. We should never transgress the law. At a very formative age, they are forced to question that entire presumption. And so for me, the danger of articulating institutions far enough away from norms is there are much more complex effects within the system in terms of its legitimacy that are non-trivial. But apropos to your point, to me, it's like they should absolutely be calibrated to take into account enforcement, but at the same time, that enforcement, the cost of that enforcement will directly vary as a function of the gap between normative preferences of the community and the institutions that are articulated ideally to kind of crystallize or formalize those normative preferences.
All right, so let's do the next one online, Case, and then after that, I think we're gonna have to do a lightning round of the folks in the room. Otherwise, we're not gonna get through everybody. All right.
Hello.
Hey, Case.
Hello. It's Jason Zargum.
Do you want me to ask it? I have the
Yeah,
notes.
you can ask it.
Okay. So, Eric, this probably won't surprise you, having worked with Case and I, but the question is that you detailed the institution, the rules that address risks that are identified in advance, and norms as providing affordances for addressing Knightian uncertainty and just, making decisions in the face of events that weren't previously reasoned about. And there's a space kind of between those two where an institution has a set of affordances given to maybe some delegates authority or otherwise empowers an executive to make a decision, and thus the institutional framework imbues them with, let's say, the right to make a choice with constraints within a set. And so then there are norms that reflect the, what is an appropriate way to go about rendering that decision, which at least, from our perspective, relates to not just what decisions they make and whether it's within the scope of the power that was given to them, but also something about the way they justify it, the way that they make it, say pursuant to purpose. And as you can kind of imagine, this is somewhat motivated by the data trust work and the way in which the trustees are empowered to effectively negotiate or apply pressure on behalf of a larger group. And so, reasoning about the difference between the institutional structure that gives them power and maybe norms that constrain or influence the way they exercise it. I don't know if you could kind of clarify how you think about that particular relation between kind of more formal institutional rules and norms.
Yeah, and I view that in the light of why we have written Supreme Court decisions. And it's not just to firm up the sort of the precedential nature of them, but imagine if it was just an outcome, an outcome, an outcome. If you think that our perception of our Supreme Court decisions is politicized right now, if it was just we are actually banning abortion or we're severely curtailing your gun rights, no justification given, no normative valence interpretable upon the person reading them. And so for me, what you're describing is what I liken, and I use the example of Facebook's oversight board, but it's the need for human judgment ex post to adjust the fit of the system to circumstances that don't perfectly fit the existing institutions as they've been articulated, or just fully unanticipable circumstances that no one could have thought of. And so that's particularly unpleasant, though, for all the people that love smart contracts, all the people that love the finality of the execution of the terms on blockchain networks, is saying, well, you just need a human decision maker who will decide at that context specific time when the uncertainty has been revealed. That's not particularly satisfying for those who want fully algorithmic or fully automated governance. And I think there are contexts that are tractable to quite a bit of automation in terms of their resolution, but the data trust, and those two are on the board of trustees for the data trust to which I was alluding, by definition, we're monitoring in real time uses and users of the data and revenue derived from that data. And so we're representing a massive class of atomistic data contributors as against third parties that use the data. To me, that essentially requires human judgment, and the secret sauce isn't any particular judgment. And this is what I was flourishing at with polycentricity and veto gates. The counterparties, the users of the data, know there is an independent trust empowered to look at that, to oversee the uses of that data. That's intended to deter bad uses of the data in the first place. And so the presence of that institutional oversight can itself reduce the need for intervention ex post. To put it more bluntly, we don't ever want to use the circuit breaker function in the cases of the data trust, but it's the threat of that circuit breaker function, just like the threat of general strikes on the part of unions, that is intended to align the incentives more favorable among members to the data trust in this case, but any group outcome.
Okay, time for a lightning round. First we have Jamie, then Gustavo, and then Subi.
Yes, thank you for your talk. So many fascinating things. So you've talked about normative changes in social groups and how hard they are to affect. So if you start thinking about social groups in terms of, hierarchy, some people have more social capital than others. Do you see that come into play in what, in some of the ideas? I don't see it so much in this particular paper, but yeah, can you speak to that?
Absolutely agree. Celebrity endorsements, but also like I work in a reasonably hierarchical field, academia, and I also don't think all of that authority is illegitimate. Some people have a lower burden of proof to get accepted to conferences because of the amount of work they've done. And so there's definitely a variety of ways that people can sway norms. I just think it's a lot harder than saying we need this group to lobby this legislature to change this particular rule. That path is a known path, even if it's expensive and hard. How you actually successfully shift deeply held norms is to me, it's not to say leadership can't play a role. I'm very sympathetic to that point, but it's still harder is what I would rest my hat on. But absolutely agree.
Let's take both of these questions first, and then maybe you can have a final word. Does that sound good? Okay.
Should I go?
Gustavo and then Subi.
Okay, so first question is, I'm trying to connect with some ideas in economic theory. So the first one is, you can think that essentially you have a bunch of equilibria, so multiplicity of equilibria, and then an institution is essentially just a coordinating device. So in that case, an institution is a norm, essentially. So I don't fully agree with this view, but probably I think you want to engage with that literature, because in that case, if you want to say, I want to generate an outcome that is outside of the set of equilibria, it means I will not be able to find any social norm that support that. Essentially, kind of go back to some of your ideas. So the second one is maybe engage with the literature on how incentivize the punishers, because that's the key thing. So essentially, if you want to support some outcome, you need that the kind of the threat of punishment is there. Well, but somebody needs to provide incentives for the punishment. And then the final one is kind of more an open question. It's kind of an open question regarding of, is this an argument for high levels of persistence? No, because essentially what you are saying is, formal institutions are easier to change than norms, but you're saying it's like, if you pick some formal institution that is very far from norms, this is not going to be enforceable. So essentially, at the end, I read this, there is very, very, very narrow space for change, for social change, essentially. I am reading correctly your argument there.
Yes. Well, thank you for your presentation. Small observation, and then I'll put the question. The slide with the shoe and the barefoot, took me to a very interesting part of history 100 years back, when Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, as a lawyer in South Africa, was suited and in shoes, but he was in a first-class compartment, and being a person of color was thrown away from the train with his suitcase. He came back to India, gave up all of that, started wearing loincloth and barefoot, and started what is known as the nonviolent movement, which basically gave us our independence. And Martin Luther King always referred to that. My point is that he took the institution of apartheid, brought his own norms, brought something in, and got today the largest democracy is functioning because of how possibly a barefoot man from a suited pose went. So that's an observation. The question that I wanted to ask, and we discussed a lot in the morning too, that, given the decentralized nature of the internet ecosystem and everyone moved towards a multi-stakeholder kind of an approach to look at, how do you bring norms and then possibly look at the institutions, how you manage it. Working so much on the blockchain and all that, and we spoke about the financial privacy part. But if it was possibly not a multi-stakeholder, but a multilateral approach, could we have approached the institutional ecosystem far much better? Because I think we are missing it, and the more everything is spreading in terms of technology, it's creating more danger. So where would norms and institutions overplay? Thank you.
So I'll take those in reverse order. One, in terms of the Gandhi example, I think sometimes in a very salient way, breaking institutions or disobeying them is an interesting form of shifting normative change. So it raises to the attention that action and therefore might create a space for normative change. But to me, that brings me to, I guess I'll alternate. That brings me to Gustavo's point, which is I do think that there are and you hear the narrow corridor. Douglas North's famous rejoinder to people in Latin America when they asked him how to get better institutions, he said, get a different history. And so I'm not that dismal, but I think that there's an important kernel of truth in that, which is these are such an emergent phenomenon that our ability to deliberately construct norms is less than we think. And that actually places a pretty massive limit vis-a-vis the arguments I make as to the extent to which institutions can shift norms in a more productive direction. I think they do. There's definitely a feedback loop. And some people, especially in places where the rule of law is respected and the rules generally reflect the underlying normative firmament to a great extent, for them, just hearing that someone has broken the law is enough for them to have a normative response. It almost doesn't matter what the law is. Although ultimately, has no one in here ever sped in their car? So clearly there's distinctions in terms of the gravity of the sort of normative divergence that you're willing to take on. I do want to return briefly to the multi-stakeholder point, which I think is, to the extent there's an identifiable normative core for the global issues facing us, whether it be cybersecurity, you name like the actual truly global issues, then yes, we definitely want to identify and to the greatest extent possible, reify that core. But I published a piece last fall in MIT Computational Law Report And the punchline is in the title: Governance as Conflict. Constitution of shared values defining the future margins of disagreement. And my contention is that structurally, the issues that emerge for a governance system to resolve are the ones over which there is disagreement, for two very simple stylized reasons. The first being, if a particular group decides this is what we need to do next, this is who needs to do it, this is how it should be done, these are all our individual contributions to that thing we all agree needs to be done in this specific way. If it's 100% agreement over all those verticals I've mentioned, that will occur endogenously. Literally, you do not need the governance system to say, this is the thing everyone agrees on, what should be done, who should do it, at what cost, where, when, and how. But the more you approach perfect 50-50 disagreement or a plurality of disagreement, if the issue is more complex than a binary one, the more you naturally need to have the processes of governance to say, this is what we need to do, notwithstanding the considerable disagreement within our group about how to proceed. But it's even stickier than that, and this is taking a page from constitutional political economy, which is, especially in private organizations, but even in public organizations, governments, people are there contributing to the system because in expectation they receive a set of benefits, rents as they're called. But if you posit heterogeneity within the group, everyone has there for slightly to significantly different reasons. But then approaching the unforeseen, so another axiom I use to reach this conclusion is simply non-ergodicity, then any change to that status quo implicates the balance of rents that are expected from that system differently depending on the heterogeneous identity of a given individual. Put more bluntly, legal change creates winners and losers such that any decision within a group will provoke conflict because of its heterogeneous effect on the expected rents of individuals within the system. And so this is part of this same research stream, which is, you're probably like, if you study governance, so you're like, yes, that tracks. That doesn't seem particularly brilliant. But for people engaged in protocol design, coming together and constituting a new DAO, the number of times that I've seen them be like, well, why are you talking about conflict? We're here to do this cool thing. We all agree this thing is cool. We want to do the thing. Let's just constitute a DAO in furtherance of the thing, and we'll agree forevermore. And I'm like, that is absolutely like backwards. The moment you constitute the thing, you're defining the future margins of disagreement that will predictably emanate according to the mechanics I've already described. And so for me, it's not a dismal view of governance, it's just a realistic view, but it's one that suggests at a minimum, the more stakeholders you bring into a particular important decision, the more you are sort of laying the seeds for disagreement. And so for me, it's not to say we shouldn't be trying it, but it's darn hard. And the more stakeholders you bring in, the more heterogeneity, and therefore the more disagreement over what we even need to do.
All right, and with that, very, very lighthearted. Thank you, Eric. We're gonna move in the other room and continue the conversation, have some lunch, but first a round of applause.
There you go, man.